Welcome to your daily Detroit showing what to know and where to go in Southeast Michigan. It is Tuesday, November 12th, 2024. I am J.R. Stays. And it is the week after the election. I feel like we've had a little bit of time to think about things, to process things, to get a little bit more of a local lens on things, and frankly, to breathe a little bit. And joining me on the line is none other than our old friend, Steve Freese, veteran journalist for the New York Times, Newsweek, Politico, and many others. And he also writes the newsletter for the Ann Arbor Observer. Steve, how are you feeling? How are you doing?
I'm numb. I'm trying to accept that this is what our country wants and that I and many, many other people did not know that, did not understand it, did not get it, but mostly just trying to take in what has been delivered without the constant response. Because at this point, it doesn't matter if you want to argue that Donald Trump is a criminal or a impeached insurrectionist or any number of other things that a lot of people see. It doesn't matter that the last time he was in office, he botched the pandemic and many people died. It doesn't matter that his children exploited the office and made many, many millions of dollars for themselves. None of that matters now. None of it matters anymore. This is what we have. We have a president who is elected by a majority of Americans, and in fact, a popular majority, which we can get back to in a moment, because I persistently had said that couldn't happen. And that just shows you just how off base I was. I guess I apologize.
Hey, listen, we got one thing right, and that Alyssa Slotkin would outpace Kamala Harris. We got that right.
Mm-hmm. And we also were correct that the polling was wrong.
Oh, the polling was so wrong.
But it was wrong in the other direction that we didn't understand. That's just really hard, It's hard to understand that there was, in fact, a groundswell of young voters and a diverse group of young voters who really were not happy with the country and really did want this kind of change. And, back when they were polling a popularity of Obamacare, I used to feel like it wasn't fair to look at the polling on Obamacare, which when it first was launched was a bit of a mess and was pretty underwater, that only 40% or something of Americans liked it. And I felt like what that polling was missing was the fact that it doesn't mean that 60% don't like it. It means that some portion of 60% don't want Obamacare, and some portion wanted more than that, wanted Medicare for all, or wanted something more progressive. And so I looked at the polling on, for example, Joe Biden's popularity, and I felt like that was probably a similar thing, that it wasn't that so many Americans didn't like him. It's that they wanted more. Not necessarily the case that the people who were opposing Joe Biden and unhappy with his presidency were all feeling the same form of disenchantment. But in fact, at least from what we learned over the last week or so, they were. An awful lot of people were willing to give Donald Trump another try and were looking very much for the thing that those of us who are concerned about this were warning against. A lot of people want a president with an excessive amount of power because, they're accustomed now to Congress being broken and not being able to accomplish anything. And they want change, and the only way to have that, I guess, is to just break the whole system.
Kamala Harris stood for a party that stood for institutions, and I've gotten a lot of feedback from various shows, and I'm going to go through all of it at some point with everybody because each show elicited different feedback. But one of the keys was people are just tired of the current system. They don't believe in the current system. They don't believe that the Congress is going to look out for them. They don't believe that any of this is working for them. And whether it's economic issues, which really came up with a lot of people, other people kind of shared with me that all politicians to them are pretty awful. So if you think all politicians are absolutely terrible, you just think that Donald Trump got persecuted more than other ones do. And I heard some of that feedback too. And I also heard some feedback from people going, I voted for women's rights in Michigan. I expect those to be upheld, but I also voted for Donald Trump. I heard from people who voted for Alyssa Slotkin and also for Donald Trump. And to me, it's something where it's like, okay, I missed something really important there.
Well, and that is very interesting because to split your ticket is an extremely deliberate thing to do. It takes a rationale that means that people aren't just walking into the voting booth and they're deluded about Donald Trump, so they go that direction. I mean, some people, I guess. Sometimes around this time of year, I like to think about what the person of the year kind of thing would be for Time magazine. And obviously it's going to be Trump. But they always have sort of secondary ones. And I think that a pretty strong runner-up would be the ticket splitter. Because you look around this country and the same people voted for Trump and voted for a Democrat for Senate in Arizona and Nevada and Michigan and Wisconsin. And these are very different politicians. Tammy Baldwin is in Wisconsin is not Alyssa Slotkin. They are of different ilks in their own party. And yet people did this. They voted one and the other. And that's how they rationalized. Maybe they thought that the Democrats would keep the Senate, and so there would be a check. I don't know. But I don't know that they thought about it in those sorts of strategic details. Here's the thing I'll say, though. We are all, those of us who very seriously expected that Kamala Harris was going to win and maybe even run the table. We were, and we should acknowledge this because it's really important, we were in the same kind of bubble that we were talking about other people being in. Mm-hmm. And, as you and I were going through the past several months, whenever we would criticize the tactics of the Kamala Harris campaign, whether we would question why she's not going to a college campus or why she's not going to a mosque or why she's not doing this interview in public or why she's not doing, and why she's not showing up in Michigan as much. All of those things that we talked about, we would get angry response from some listeners who felt like we were being too critical of her at the same time as he's a criminal and all that other stuff. And we tried to explain and we tried to talk about the idea that we were trying to analyze campaign tactics and sort of the reality of politics, but people didn't want to hear it. They weren't enjoying that.
Oh, we got a lot of angry mail, how we were being disrespectful or all these other things. But I think at the end of the day, Kamala Harris had a very difficult task in front of her, because if you look at just the numbers and the patterns of elections, this was going to be a difficult race for Democrats, no matter who you were running, no matter who. She put together a lot in a short amount of time, but I also think that we need to have a discussion around messaging, around where people are at, how people reach out, because I feel like some of this I don't know if it would have made the difference with this much swing, but I feel like it could have in some states. I feel like there are lessons to learn because, honestly, Republicans handled messaging in 2024 and reaching out to who matters in the media in 2024 way, way better. And I could share some things, but I'll be honest with you all that, and I didn't do it because I really was trying to get a balance of both candidates if we were going to have people on. I could have had pretty much any Republican I wanted on this show. Whereas when it came to Democrats, it was like we didn't exist. And it was really telling to me, and maybe next midterm or cycle, I will approach it differently. But we're really frustrating to see how poorly Democrats handled how we consume media has changed. Like it's not in change. It's not in transition. It has. And you have to meet people where they're at.
Well, and what's interesting is that we're specifically talking about the podcast medium. And we're specifically talking about Trump going on Joe Rogan and any pretty much anything that his son told him people like to listen to. And here's the thing about that. Listeners to this show will probably agree that podcast interviews are not a frivolous part of the media. Remember back in, I think it was the second Obama run, when he was doing like Between Two Ferns, and he was appearing on like various comedy programs and
Mark
things like
Maron.
that. Yeah, that all seemed very beneath the dignity of a campaign. It was fun and it reached people in a certain way, but you could argue that it was a dumbing down of how to reach voters. And the idea of spending 3 hours on one interview, or even an hour or even a half hour, just talking to various interviewers on podcasts, those are substantive conversations. They may veer into some frivolity, and they may not be as, well fact-checked as you want, but that's why you go there. You go there, if you're Kamala Harris or Tim Walz, you go there because you get to say what you want to say. The host is usually pretty respectful, and you counter whatever nonsense was being spewed from the other side during their turn. That's how you do it these days. And they didn't. I think it's great in some ways that Alyssa Slotkin won, because I think she was the better candidate. And I think that she's just very, very bright. And I think she's got a very interesting career ahead of her. But she also played it very safe during this campaign. And it was surprising, because when she ran for Congress, she didn't. But when you move up the ladder, you end up with a lot more advisors who are a lot more risk averse, or who just have a different approach to things. I mean, Alyssa Slotkin did not, I tried several times for various pieces I was working on to try to reach her for various things. It didn't matter. She was never available.
And you were writing for outlets like, I believe, Hour, correct? Like stuff that you look at it where it's not like you're trying to do some sort of right-wing Daily Wire stuff.
Yeah, I mean, whatever it was. I mean, and I have spoken to her several times in the past. So it's not like she didn't even know who I was. And I'm not complaining, and I'm not saying this is why she won or lost or anything like that. I'm not taking that kind of self-aggrandizement. We're just pointing out, you and I are just pointing out, that Democrats were playing an old game. And the game has changed, and they lost. Now, here's the thing that happens now. And this is the thing that you all need to keep in mind. I'm looking online and I'm seeing Harry Enton on CNN saying that there's no reason to think that the Democrats can come back in the next 2 or 4 or even 8 years because of this, and this. And I'm here to tell you that they say that all the time. And American opinion changes very, very quickly. If Americans are pissed off and miserable with the economy they have right now, and the kind of assistance and jobs programs that the Biden administration passed, how are they going to feel when it still doesn't get better for them? I'm not saying they're not right to feel frustrated. I guess the idea that a lot of Americans feel like they're not going to be able to do better than their parents. They're not going to be able to give their kids what they want to give them. I get all that. And the problem is that American people will just continue to lash out at whoever the incumbent is, on and on and on. And so, it's just this whiplash that we're going through as a culture. And the Democrats, they screwed up their messaging. Yeah, and definitely things would have been a bit different if Joe Biden had chosen not to run and allowed for a Democratic primary. But in a lot of ways, the cake was baked long ago, and we just didn't know it.
In hindsight, it seems so clear.
Doesn't it now? I had a lot of problems with polling, and I had what I thought were reasonable reasons for them. And in fact, I was right to the extent that polling does not pick up younger voters, and that they were the ones that made a big swing here and surprised a lot of people. The numbers of younger and new and first-time voters who voted for Trump was pretty substantial. It was a pretty significant margin, and we never saw that in polling. So I wasn't wrong about the problem with understanding that demographic. I think they did a better job than I thought they would at just sort of the overall picture. And the overall picture was that Joe Biden was, in fact, unpopular. Whether it's his fault or not, who knows? He certainly didn't have the ability, the charisma, or the public presence to fight back about it. And that's a problem.
Nor the ability to just take credit for wins. And Harris didn't take the opportunities to separate herself. You know, there are a number of issues that Democrats completely missed the ball on, like immigration. But if you look at where Democrats win, it's not states that, you know, yes, there's California, but outside of that, it's not states that are directly on that border. If you're in New York, which Republicans made gains up there too. If you're in some of these states,
big gains up there.
Well, that's the other thing. They made gains across the board. This isn't about one state, one group. The left is going to eat itself now for the next few months.
Yep.
And try to point fingers at everything, but you can't put it on one particular thing. This was a multi-part loss. And one of the big losses was immigration and not understanding just how important it was, and not understanding to groups like Latinos what it mattered to them and how they interpreted it, right? Or even you think about groups like Muslim groups and people showing up for Trump, which they did. They also showed up a lot for Jill Stein. I wonder if that vote will also be a conditional vote, meaning that vote will go away if that issue, if things don't improve on that issue under Trump in 2 years, that vote could flip again.
It did happen the first time, right? He came into office and he did a lot of things and people didn't like it. And 3 election cycles in a row, the voters went the other direction. Even in 2022, that was maybe a more of an abortion Dobbs reaction, but it was really, reacting to something substantial that Donald Trump caused, which was the turnover of Roe v. Wade. The only guarantee in American politics right now is that Americans have a very short temper. They're extremely impatient. Look, Donald Trump probably would have gotten a second term if it wasn't for COVID, and look at all the mayhem that went on in his first term. It's all of a piece that we are living in a very angry world. We are hyped up to be even more angry by everything we see on our devices every day. You and I kind of hit a dead end when we were talking about this a month or two ago, when we were talking about how that cycle of anger and tribalism is broken. It doesn't seem like it can be.
We're looking at our phones more and more and our neighbors less and less, right? Like there was a time where it's like, oh, well, if I'm doing okay, my neighbors are doing okay. Now we're scrolling through Instagram and wondering why we don't, you know what I mean? We're always comparing ourselves to Joneses that are probably not even real.
Yeah, they're not. I agree with all of that. It's a bleak outlook in some ways. I think that the reality is that what we might be looking at is an era in which both sides get a big push every other time. And when you have that opportunity, you better take it. And so when you look at the Joe Biden record, they did. They took it. When you look at the Obama record, they took it. And then when you look at the Trump record, what were they mostly concerned about? They were mostly concerned about social issues and judges, and they took it. So it's just sort of like this big shove, one direction or the other. The thing that was and is alarming about Trump is that he's inclined to ignore the law and the Constitution, and there's nothing anymore that really can stop him. That makes it different. That makes it feel like the shoving match is not fair anymore, and it won't be fair anymore. There are some voices on the right that are trying to insist that he's not going to exact retribution on people, or he's not going to, I don't know, any number of things that he has said that we were afraid of. But I don't know why you think that. I mean, nobody can say what he's going to do except for him, and he can't really even say it. So those things are very scary. But there have been periods, many periods in our nation's history, when people were afraid to talk because they could be persecuted. I'm thinking primarily of the McCarthy era, and I've wondered as a kid growing up what that must have been like. How could that have possibly happened? How could people have fallen for all of that? And now now you see it, right? Now you see how people can be led to decide that certain basic fundamental rights of the Constitution are dispensable or not very useful when other problems exist, when the threat of nuclear war and Soviet domination, that was what was going on then. Now it's sort of an economic globalism.
I want to touch on something that a number of listeners brought up that I think is a little difficult to talk about, but I feel like we should acknowledge. Like, a lot of listeners talked about their feeling that Harris lost because she was a woman, and that was something that she was voted against very actively for the simple fact that she was a woman. Do you have thoughts around that?
I am sure that is true. I am sure that is true in a sense that I didn't believe before. In a way, Hillary Clinton was a woman, and some of the reasons why people didn't like her were misogynist, but they didn't know Kamala Harris as well as they knew Hillary Clinton, and still they didn't want her. When you talk about young women, young men, when you talk about middle-aged women who felt like she wasn't them. And I found that surprising because I thought she would come across as something of a suburban soccer mom kind of person.
I thought that was part of what was going to push her over the top with what. Remember earlier on, we talked about what if she can win white women, she wins the White House. She did not. She did not win white women, and she lost. Game over.
You think about all these little breadcrumbs that were laid by the Trump campaign over the course of the campaign, and you realize they really did add up to a lot. Trump floating the idea that she wasn't really black. She picked this, she picked that. Well, there's a lot of colorism in the black community. There are a lot of black people who resented black women, or more black men, but there were a lot of black people who resented that she married a white man, that maybe she wasn't fully black, whatever that means. And even though Obama had a white mother, he looked black enough. And also there was a certain novelty and excitement to his campaign that was not matched. He was and he is a better politician, period.
Well, he could sit down and do those kinds of conversations. I feel like with Harris, I know very well that she doesn't listen to music very often, but she really likes Stevie Wonder and the classics when she does, because that is the answer that she gave on 5 different podcasts, like 5 different interviews that I saw. And I'm like, oh, that's too much on message. That's too on the nose for 2024. That works for 2008. That doesn't work for 2024. I do want to note, though, black women showed up for Kamala Harris. 100% they did. There's no doubt. She 100%, black women, backbone of the Democratic Party, understood the assignment with her.
But the other breadcrumbs, the whole conversation about childless cat ladies that we thought, God, they are just killing themselves going on about this idea that you're not a real American, or you don't understand the country if you haven't had children. Well, a lot of people feel that way.
I hear
a lot of people.
I'll be honest with you, Steve. I hear that in feedback sometimes, because they'll be like, well, you don't understand anything because you don't have kids. It's like, number one, how did you find out I didn't have kids per se, unless you're a very deep listener? But also, go on. Like, I don't care. Like that's the kind of stuff I don't want to hear about. But that latent thing is in there in American culture.
And the thing that Americans are able to do, which is fascinating to me, is a lot of Americans are able to listen to something that should insult them and decide, well, they don't mean me, and go on from there. And that is literally how this is going to be for an awful lot of the voters who were Latino and Arab. They believed that somehow they were different than the people that Donald Trump was campaigning against. And maybe they are, maybe they're not.
Well, there's going to be some things to talk about. I mean, we're going to definitely stay in touch. I don't know how often it's going to go with the news. We've got a gubernatorial race coming up that we could spend a whole episode on. Later this week, Detroit Mayor Mike Duggan is going to make an announcement about his political future. There's like a bunch of stuff coming up, but I want to publicly acknowledge, Steve, that I really appreciate you, the time through this campaign that you have put into this podcast and you doing all the things that you have. Turns out we're not going to have a big recount thing. We're not going to have those other stuff, but there's still going to be stuff that we're going to be in touch on. It's different than we thought, but we are here, Steve.
We'll see where it goes. And, I do hope that our greatest fears are not realized. I don't want an economic collapse in this country. I don't want tariffs that will cost tons of money. I don't want to turn on the news and see rows of people being frog marched out of the country. I don't want any of that. Maybe it won't happen. Probably it will.
Well, with that, I am Jer Stays. Steve Freese, veteran political journalist. I really appreciate you. As always, you can follow us on all your favorite podcast apps, sharing what to know and where to go in Southeast Michigan. Remember that you are somebody, and we'll see you around Detroit.